So, hello everyone. We're late because I'm in Europe and we have a change of time. So,
Oh,
clearly, cultural problems, and my team didn't call me until now. So, pushing the blame, pushing the blame. All right, my friends, we have an exciting time today. We will be talking about learner centeredness, and I would like to share my PowerPoint with you just in case there's things that are worth actually engaging you in. Learner centeredness has been with us, Andrew, since when? Look, this is not a personal thing about age, but you have been with it for a while, and you know the culture, you know the discourses, and I also have been, at these international conferences forever and have heard different trends and so on. So, as I am trying to organize myself here with the delay that we're having due to the time change, maybe Andrew, would you spare a minute or three talking about your own, and just in a nutshell, before we go into the depth of it, um, about learner centeredness from the perspective of a timeline you've experienced over the last 50 years of your profession, of being part of the profession. Andrew, you are muted.
sorry. Learner-centeredness, to some extent, is nothing new. We've always worried about learners and about people and how to make their lives better and respond to their needs. The only problem is that we've tended to use statistical models to deal with people, and we've also tended to accept the administrative boundaries which have been set for us by universities and so on. So we have classes, the classes are usually based on age, and everybody progresses according to the rules of age. And and everybody sits for exams and passes exams, and we don't really respond to learners' needs, or we haven't responded to learners' needs. We have assumed that we will be able to teach certain things, and that these things would be learned by the students. In fact, that's not true. And although there have been many statements like from the past, like teachers teach and learners learn, but what learners learn is not necessarily what teachers teach. Um, the issue of learner-centeredness in the sense of a preoccupation, I guess, has been around for about 30 years or thereabouts. Um, there are some mentions in the literature about learner-centeredness, which will place it in terms of the literature in a more accurate place. But the concern about learner-centeredness is really about is really quite old. Just in recent years, it's become more prominent, and people have talked about it more, and people have wanted to respond. They've talked about needs analyses, for example, or you have to do a needs analysis. You have to know your student. The teacher has to know the student. But in reality, it's very difficult for teachers to know anything about students that is significant in terms of their learning possibilities. So, in a nutshell, we are all worried about learner centeredness, but how do we go about doing it? is a different issue. And how do we do it in a mass market, particularly? I mean, we've shifted from the notion of the classroom, and, where we have a small group of people learning a language. We're now in a mass market, and we have to worry about learner-centeredness in this mass market. How do we do it? Is it possible? Is it even feasible? And I guess that's some of the things that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. That's pretty much what most of us here at this meeting um, pretty much understand, with your additional insight that, to summarize, not everything is as obvious as we think. So we will engage Lala shortly, because I would like to know from Lala some of his personal experiences with this
Yeah,
type of narrative. But I would like
yeah,
to share first a couple of slides. So just to give us a little bit of a frame in which we will just slot in, so that we are not
yeah,
all over the place talking too much. So I've written here for myself, as I was trying to organize my own thoughts about today, that learning is all about feedback. Um, Nothing controversial here, maybe a little bit pointy, and maybe some people didn't realize it, but learning is all about feedback. How am I doing? Right? Do you understand me? Or am I understandable? Right? What have I done wrong? Things like that. So, and I think this wasn't just the issue in learner-centered pedagogy. It was also an issue with audiolingual pedagogy and whatever other pedagogies there have been. I mean, we've been teaching languages in the post-Second World War, not the Third World War, the Second World War era, for quite a while now, and we've invented many pedagogies. I always say to my doctoral students, there's only my undergraduate students, there's only two pedagogies, the good one and the bad one. It makes things easier. Uh, right? And when I teach, I try to engage my students in thinking about the principles that will allow them to differentiate between the good and the bad ones. There's nothing grandiose about it, um, because when I am a teacher educator, I come into a setting or my students give me assignments and I have to assess. And I can't say everybody is right, because not everybody is right, right? When you go to a restaurant and you order a pancake and you get something that barely, you can recognize as food, it's bad cooking. So I think that the topic is broad. I looked into, and I'm not going to read too much of this article to you, but I just by accident on my computer I found this article. It's like nice, 5 pages of the paper, and I thought I would share it with you. It's a nice introduction to the concept of learner-centeredness from the perspective of um, what everybody understands, right? So they're not going too deep into it. They just introduce the narrative of learner-centeredness. So I'm just sharing it here. I don't have a clue how I found that paper, so I don't even know what ES journal stands for. So I just found it on my computer. So what he's saying is that things have changed. So I'm introducing this a little bit so that to have some historical base before we actually talk about it. So this guy is saying, Arsenio Sanchez Calvo is saying that things have changed since Chomsky, because until then, um, we had audiolingual methodology and people were thinking scientifically, and maybe it was the right method to actually use. Not necessarily that audiolingual methodology was the answer to all questions. I don't know. Anyway, so that's what we had. That was that sort of approach. I'm not interested in the approach of audiolingual method, more like ways of trying to legitimize. So they were looking into science for tools to legitimize what they were doing. And in the 1950s, that's what they had. So anyway, Chomsky came up with this idea that there is some innate capacity of human beings to learn language. And since then, this person is saying, Arsenio Sanchez Calvo is saying, since then, people were looking for that mechanism in many different ways. And I think that what happened, Andrew is very good at it, explaining the history of it. But in a nutshell, what I understood over the years from Andrew was that language teaching was seen like no different than cooking. So there might be a science of cooking, really, but it really goes into biology and chemistry. And so second language pedagogy was looking for the mother discipline. And rather than creating their own, they were looking for mother discipline, and they got hung up on, Andrew, on what discipline? On linguistics. So anyway,
Oh, yeah. I don't think of it as a discipline. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
right. So they got hung up on linguistics,
Well, they
and
got
now
hung up on they got hung up on on linguistics because they were interested in language, right? So everybody who teaches language loves language, and so people say, well, so what's the science of language? And the science of language is linguistics. But unfortunately, what we are involved in is not the science of language. What we are involved in is the science of learning. And that is it's a different kettle of fish.
and I think what um, to add to it, if you can actually read this quote from this scholar Calvo, what you see actually, the shift was not always the shift, the core words in this quote from this person's article is neither language nor learning. The shift, although learning, yes, but the real focus is active agents involved. That's what he's saying here. We're no longer passive tabula rasa, which is the black slate, what is it, the empty slate, but we have active agents involved. So it's the student, right? So what Andrew is saying here, I presume that yes, learning, but not learning per se, but also the individual in the context of the process of learning. So one would have hoped back when the shift happened, the conceptual shift from from the audiolingual method to now maybe learning more about how we learn. What would have been good also is to actually take the learner with us and learn a little bit about the learner. And I'm not saying that it hasn't been done, but we will look at it at that. We will look at the traditions in which we follow, which ensued. But active agents involved. That's the shift from passive to active. And now Andrew was talking about these terminologies that started to actually come up. So research was taking now, paying greater attention to how learning takes place and the importance of learners, different factors, including learners' affective factors like motivation and enjoyment, right? So these things from psychology. So the terms that came up, contrived. Well, that's very interesting because the next point, you have authentic materials and then you have meaningful learning. I'm not sure whether I included it here when I was typing it, but it was meaningfulness and yet contrived. So I remember when I was doing my PhD or whatever degree, and I was reading Widowson and thinking to myself, what's contrived? Andrew, what's contrived? And he kept explaining me, and I couldn't understand because Widowson's book on task-based teaching is excellent until the page like 90. And then it's almost a reversal. It's Widdowson that felt, in my view, contrived, couldn't find himself in learner-centered pedagogy, and then somehow compromise all the principles, all the semiotics, all the study of meaning that he actually explains quite nicely in that little book. And then he goes into this contrived yet meaningful tasks. Then he talks, obviously, he talked about authentic materials, yet tasks are contrived. And then later on in the 90s, when the books from Vygotsky or whatever were translated, we started to have this term of scaffolding. Were we doing scaffolding in the 70s, 80s? Or is it just in the 90s? That's something to think about. Then we had so there was this era of trying to find how to support communicative skills, that was called back then, but at the same time focusing on form. So that was there was this division now. And I think that learner-centeredness very often struggled with that meaning versus form dichotomy. Then group activities. I remember when I was a kid, we had group activities. Didn't say learner-centeredness, but never mind. Group activities, inductive learning, which is something that learner-centeredness really paid the price for, because the crowd from systemic functional linguistics came in, and we will look at it later on, and said, you can't do inductive learning. Students need focus on form, and here's the form. So we were very often, as we had been struggling with that learner-centeredness concept and the dichotomy between meaning and form, we were, in my view, losing the baby with the bathing water, with the bath water. Because when the genre-based pedagogy came in, we will examine it shortly. Well, they said, well, you can't just do inductive learning. You've got to tell them as it is. You've got to explain to them how the language works. But anyone who is here present, or who will be watching our broadcast later on, so thank you to the audience for coming here and being part of it. You know that there are different models of language. A holiday is not the only model. So is it all right to use different models, or is SFL pedagogy having a monopoly? Is it the best model to the exclusion of all other gods, of all other thinking that might come afterwards? So anyway, Andrew, you were teaching. You were at the prime of your of your career when these terminologies were popping up, and yet you were a most wonderful teacher of French at the University of Queensland. And I presume what you were doing, you were pretty much deaf to those discourses. It's not like you listen to someone like Noonan or something like this, and you say, oh, no, now I see everything, and I'm just going to do what someone else told me. I think you were trying to work out your own meaning in all of this. Can you tell us how you ended up being such a great French teacher and actually, in some way, doing very much learner-centeredness, but none of these terms that are in here actually were the leading concepts in your pedagogy? And I know that because I watch you teach. Not often enough. I mean, you didn't do contrived yet meaningful tasks. You would have never said it, right? So would you be able to tell us what made you a great teacher? Were you following Widdowson?
Well, first of all, I was teaching French, and French
In Australia,
yes, in
in the
Australia.
80s, which means we didn't have computers and it wasn't that cheap. Your students were not going every week to France to blubber in French.
Well, well, actually, we did have computers in the 80s. We were one of the first universities to have computers set up for the teaching of languages at the University of Queensland.
In the
Uh,
library.
and and in 19 yes, in the library, and in 1983, believe it or not, we had a fully online course which was taught to develop listening comprehension.
But they were just exercises. They were not.
Well, they were and they weren't. They were exercises. Let's call them exercises that were supposed to develop listening comprehension skills.
Why did you go that way? Why did you go into technology? I mean, what? I mean, I was doing. I did French in the University of Queensland. I didn't know you then, and I was sitting through those exercises. Why?
Well,
Why
you
did you go
weren't
that
sitting.
way?
You were not sitting through those exercises. You were sitting
Uh-huh.
through somebody else's exercises. What we did was to develop some listening comprehension materials which relied on both top-down and bottom-up processing, and which required students to interact with text, and then at one level do a lot of. It had also a lot of emphasis on bottom-up processing. So we were trying to get students to confront the text that they were listening to with what was in their heads and what they believed to be hearing. And so, as a result of that, I wrote some feedback systems. You were talking about feedback before, and I think that was really important. We were developing some feedback systems which were individualized. The reason for that was that even then, leaving aside Widdowson and the contrived tasks and so on, even then, I and others believed that education should be personalized. But personalization did not did not mean getting to know other people. It meant students confronting their difficulties and finding solutions for them, and having some help to do it with.
So, what was the principle? Because you couldn't really in the 80s, early 80s, and even today, um, fine tune for every student. So you were doing a strategy which was broad
You,
enough. Yeah.
yeah.
So how did you?
Well, in terms of the technology, we had three levels. It was very simple. We were chunking language, or splitting language into chunks, and students were supposed to write down what they believed they heard. And sometimes they believed right, and sometimes they believed wrong. And we did a kind of quick survey before making the materials available. We did a quick survey of students and asked them to write down what they thought they heard, not on computer, but actually in a classroom situation, and collected a series of mistakes that they made, put those mistakes into the system. And so we had three levels of activity, if you like, or not activity, of feedback, if you like. One of them was if they got the answer correct, or if they got all the words correct, then the system said congratulations and didn't touch the what the student had written. If the student made some of the predicted errors, then those errors were flagged by the system, And the predicted errors were the errors that we collected from the students in the um, pre-delivery stage of the software. And so if they got it right, if they made the mistakes that we had predicted or that the other students had made, we would give them some messages about that. And if they if they made mistakes that had not been predicted, then the words would simply be underlined or struck through and told this word does not exist in this answer. So they had three levels of feedback which were possible, and they were required to rethink what they had written on the basis of the feedback that we had given them. The feedback, as I said, had been partly worked out on the basis of what other students had gotten wrong. And it's not that one, but it's something like that.
So here,
And
the text was "Vous savez qu'il y a trois France," and
yes,
the student is writing "Vous savez
can't see it.
la trois Frances." So the feedback is sorry. So basically, the speaker was saying, there are three Frances, and the
Right.
student didn't. Yeah.
Right. We know that there are three Frances, and in this case, vous savez is correct. The word la is not included in the correct response, so it got struck out. The word trois was correct, so it was okay, and the word France was in red because the student had written an S on the end of France, whereas in French, typically the convention is not to put an S on there. So in
Even if
this
it is
case, it was
plural.
more,
Even if it is plural, right? Trois
even
Francs.
if it is plural, even if it is plural. It's a bit like family names. You say, in English, you say the Martins with an S, but in French, you say the Martins without the S, les Martins without the S. So,
There are some commands on the bottom. Play
and
the
so there were
file
some
chunk.
comments. It said, sorry, but for some reason the convention, oops, it's gone. The convention is to write about a plural of France in the singular, e.g., trois France with an E and no S. So it's giving them some clues. In this case, it's giving them an answer and it's giving them an explanation for the answer. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. A lot of the answers that we gave were a lot vaguer, simply because we didn't just want to give students a correct answer, but we wanted students to think about the reasons why their answers didn't work.
So SOS was
SOS,
like,
the SOS button actually gives them the answer if they are desperate about it. Some of them became desperate, but there were several levels of feedback that were available. In addition, and when things got really bad, we simply gave them the answer, the correct answer, but where the incorrect words were replaced with asterisks. So they then had to make guesses about what was missing in there. So they could listen again. They could
they could listen to a
guess
chunk.
again.
They could listen to a chunk only.
They could listen to a chunk only, or they could listen to a context, or they could
The
get
whole
some
file.
feedback in terms of what we call the story so far, which is the story, which is the explanations that we had given them about how the story was developing. Because as they were listening to the story, they were also required to make global guesses, and the global guesses were summarized in this thing called the story so far to provide a context. So it was actually quite a complex system, still quite a good model to work with, and which I will be developing a little bit more at some stage. But And what was interesting about that is that well, this is a okay. This is a different program that I wrote, and it's a program where called Browse. It was it was a multimedia browser system. Students were able to have a video. They could listen to the text. They could listen to it at normal speed, slow speed, fast speed, filtered, which was with intonation highlighted and the words removed, noisy, which was an addition that we made to the video, where the audio track was covered with, not covered with noise, but mixed with noise from a conversation, from a party or something like that, to simulate people actually listening
Natural
in noisy
conditions. Yeah.
environments.
Yeah.
And noisy environments are difficult to deal with. So that was a possibility. Then you simply highlighted some of the asterisks on the right, and you wrote the answer, what you thought the words were. And in due course, you filled the whole text. You were able to fill the whole screen with the correct text, and you got some feedback. There were a number of other things that you could get, including a transcription if you wanted to, and so on.
So we
And
had
what
there's a PhD
there is a
completed with the,
PhD, there is a completed PhD at the University of Canberra on that in 2004 by my now colleague, Dr. Nataya. And she used that as a way of testing whether the students were able to improve their listening comprehension. And yes, they did. One of the difficulties that she had is that participation was a bit low at times. So students were not always able to discipline themselves to do the work because it was an out of class thing. Whereas the work that I did in 1983 at the University of Queensland, using a different system, which Anya showed you previously, everything was fully online, and the results that we, this was 1983. Remember this. This is before we had audio, interactive audio. We were using interactive tape recorders made by Tandberg, and the results were actually, we didn't publish the results, but we published the procedures. They're available in various places. And the results were that the study of the development of listening comprehension was as good as, if not better than, in class. And when I say that, I'm reminded that everybody wants results to be better than what happens in class, but actually, the no significant difference effect is quite important. The no significant difference effect is if you can do something which is as good as what you do in a classroom, then, and the conditions for it are better, then you're ahead of the game.
yeah. So some students could do actually, like you said, do particular part of the French course
Right,
in the library, so you didn't have to walk around the classroom and say, Mr. Lala, what did you hear? Mr. Andrew, what did you hear? Right, that could have
correct,
been done actually separately, and individualized would be that
correct,
everybody would be working, it's not about on their own, but at their individual pace, and could explore what your exercise made possible to explore, and also go beyond. They were in the library,
correct,
there were dictionaries back then, right? So they could have actually
correct.
asked someone else. So, ask the friend.
Well, ask a friend. And that's exactly how it worked. And the other thing that was really, there were two things that were really quite interesting. In those days, in 1980, people thought that women and old people could not deal with the technology. Well, it became very clear that they could very quickly. And in fact, one of the keenest people doing this was a 78-year-old woman who was actually not very good at French, but who spent countless hours on the computer. I don't know. They were supposed to work 2 or 3 hours a week for 15 weeks, and she worked like, so yeah, around 45 hours. She worked more than 80 hours to do the course, whereas some people finished the course in 3 weeks because they were native speakers of French or they were very good at French. So we had this really interesting situation where everything that we are talking about today, 40 years later, had already been demonstrated. Ubiquitous learning, anytime, any place learning. No, we didn't have any time, any place learning because we didn't have mobile phones. But wherever you had access to the university network, you could log into this thing and do it, and people did. And so it was really quite interesting, and I kept very detailed logs in the end, and two things came out. First of all, we had enough information to know about how good our lesson was. So we were able to change the lesson according to the feedback from students. That's a form of individualization. It was statistical in a way, but it was also a form of individualization. And so we collected everything that the students wrote and were able to make changes to the lesson to include the most unlikely guesses that students could make.
Yeah, sometimes you get speechless when a student produces something. You go like, "What the heck
That's
do I
right.
do with
That's
that?"
right. That's right. So you have these most unlikely things. And the other thing is, we had a profile for every student. We had a profile for every student. We had a collection of every student's mistakes and correct responses. And we could trace the path, the thinking path that they had gone through in order to come to their final answer. Now, that's really very interesting from a research point of view. We never published it in the end. We should have done all of these things.
At Harvard, when you teach only 1 hour a month, you would have had the time for that.
Yes, well, at Harvard I didn't. I did all of this work with a minimum of 12 hours a week of teaching.
Yeah,
Um,
and still
and
publishing and still
and
working and
it
still
and I
producing.
should have we should have been published, but it didn't get published. Anyway, the point was that we had huge amounts of data collected. We can reproduce this with a bit of work. We can reproduce that system, and when I say with a bit of work, I mean within a month. Even me doing the programming, it could be up and running, and it could be online for whoever wants to use it. And we could collect all of this stuff using modern technology and presenting the stuff also using modern technology.
Andrew, so all that information is in my chapter 8. I don't know. I don't. Do I have chapter 8 chapters? I don't know. In my chapter 3, I think, in my PhD. So that's where I was actually taking the screenshots from that. Um, I don't know how, guys, you can find that information. Um, we're hearing some children. I don't know where they're coming from.
Well, the children are coming from me because I'm in a noisy environment at the moment. Let me just close another door. Maybe that will help. Just a minute.
All right. So, but I have a question for Andrew. Okay. So,
Okay, 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 okay.
okay. So
Question go.
don't worry about the children. We love children, at least theoretically. So, so all that, no struggle between meaning and form focus, because students were trying. You had different. Just before students were doing all these precise guesses, in those exercises, they were also asked to make some global guesses about what they heard, and then they were
Yes.
going from the global guesses down, 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 down
And back up
to change
as
their
a
mind.
way
Yeah.
of verifying that their guesses were correct. You see,
So
at the moment, we spend a lot of time worrying about overall meaning of text. But our purpose, and my purpose even today, remains not only to work on meaning, which of course is the major focus, but also to work on their internal, let's call it on their internal language structures, so that they change their ideas about what it is that they were hearing. They understand the range of possible ways in which different words are spoken in
I think
different contexts.
I think where you're going now is exactly where I want to take this podcast to, and maybe finish it for today. We don't want to be here for 3 hours as we always are. We just want to, but before I go to the next slide, where I'm touching on the concept of ontology, I make a difference. I'm a little bit traditional. I make a difference between ontology and epistemology. For me, epistemology is the evidence, the knowledge basis on which you build your own worldview. But also I have ontology, which, in my view, is a question regarding how you position and on what basis how you position yourself in relation to reality. And I think that kind of discourse takes a lot of space, intellectual space, in podcasts and in philosophy, in science, and so on. But so I want to go there, but I would like you to come back to my original question, now back to the global. How come, Andrew, in the 80s, you weren't caught up in those problems, meaning focus, form focus, contrived, of why weren't you following what the textbook said? Weren't there textbooks back then? Or did you decide that whatever people say, I mean, why were you developing all these interesting things and didn't get caught up in the small picture?
Well, this will be very anti-intellectual.
You have a lot of noise there, Andrew. I
Yeah,
think
just
it's
a
not
minute. Just give me
like.
1 second. Just give me one
Okay.
second.
So, Lala, just 1 second. Has this? So, thank you for being. So today we're having just basically a team talk, right? Like
Okay,
I
very
want our
interesting.
audience. I want our audience to actually get something out of us, not just out of guests, so that they better understand where we come from. So, people who have been here with us on our podcast before, Lala is actually a former PhD student, very talented student, had PhD offers, scholarship offers from all over the place. We were very honored that he studied with us. Lala, when you hear all of that from Andrew, what he
Yeah,
was doing 40 years ago, is that
yeah.
science fiction to you?
Well, yes, yes. I was probably just was born back then, and then I think what Andrew has been doing in the last 40 years is moving away from high level of abstraction into the real practice. Well, I have attended so many conferences here in Indonesia, and I have a feeling that the concept of learner-centeredness is vague because um, it's simply a rhetoric. Whenever we actually talk about the feedback that you both have discussed, and then whenever we talk about the real system, how the student could actually have a better learning experiences, and I think we also have a very restricted policy and practice at the university level because we tend to force the students to come and learn only in the classroom. And I think um, that's not a good point to talk about the learner centeredness. And also, I, uh, I kept those basic questions when I was asked to talk about learner centeredness. I think the first question is Are you interested in how much and how well your students learn? I think that's the first question I have been keeping for myself for more than 5 years now. And then the second question is, what should English teachers do in order to maximize the learning outcomes for the students? And I think those questions are still relevant for me at the moment, who are dealing with the learning loss of the students in the context of a new curriculum. And then I also have a feeling that here in Indonesia, there is little scholarship on the concept of learner-centeredness in English language teaching discourse. Yes, people keep talking about technologically enhanced language learning. They talk about technological infrastructure, but they don't actually talk about the pedagogical infrastructure. So there is a big gap between pedagogy and technology. Well, I'm not saying that I am into the pedagogical and technological determinism, but I think since I learned a lot from you both about pedagogy of English language learning, I feel that it is time for us to talk more about pedagogy, about the students. And then I think in terms of policy and practice, at University Queensland was, well, ahead of the game, right? Back then. And I don't think that we have that strong policy that can help the students to have that intellectual maturity when they learn. Actually, I think
What do you mean
that's
by
my
that?
one.
What do you mean by
Well,
that? They don't want
I
to.
yes, yes. It's important for me to see my students coming to university to enjoy the high level learning experience, the best learning experience, and I do not want them to come to my classes just because they have to. And I think it's a disaster at the moment because since there is a closure of universities and schools, and then they are now open again. I think it's a disaster because when the students have no passions to learn, and then at the moment we don't have a strong technological infrastructure, and so we cannot provide them with the best learning experiences
So you're
after the
saying,
pandemic.
they don't want to participate in class because they've learned now bad habits of not attending,
Yep,
but
yep,
also online is not that strong either. So what will
yep,
happen is, you were saying, I think the other day when we had a
yep.
meeting, that the proficiency levels are dropping, right?
Right, right, Anya. So that's my
Yeah.
first comment.
So the message is, it looks like science fiction, whatever Andrew was doing. Andrew,
Right,
so my
right.
question to you again, why weren't you following the textbook? Why were you writing your own?
Well, I haven't talked to the textbook for 50 years, roughly. It has always been materials which we have found, or which either the teachers have found, or which the students have found, or that the students have created.
Oh, no, no, pardon me, sorry. You're answering the second question. The first question is the textbook, the pedagogic textbook written by someone, I don't know,
Yeah, no,
whoever was.
but I think they go together.
No, the textbook, the pedagogic textbook, how to teach learner-centered. So you must do this, you must do this, you must
Because,
do
well,
contracted,
okay,
meaningful
because
tasks.
I didn't read them. I mean, I chose not to read them, and
And the
I chose
University
not
of
to read them.
Queensland gave you that freedom.
Well, yes. I mean, I was at the time I was a senior lecturer, maybe not quite yet, um, and yes, the University of Queensland gave me that freedom, and the University of Queensland supported my efforts to introduce technology. In fact, there was some newspaper articles. I was interviewed on radio at the time. The point being, but the trouble was that as soon as I left, it all collapsed. And I think that's the case with a lot of technological innovation, or any innovation. As soon as the person running the innovation disappears, then the rest of the university falls back into a very traditional model.
Because if it
And
seems to me like this, you've got a champion of a new way of thinking, right? No one else is buying into it because they're sitting on something from the 1920s. And then, by the time this method becomes popularized or people understand it, like 50 years passes. And then
yes,
everybody goes on the bandwagon. But by then, someone else is struggling. So we're always sort of catching up backwards.
that's correct. And but one thing has changed. One thing has changed, and that is COVID came. The COVID-19 pandemic came, which forced everybody to go online with basically no support. And, Nataya, the person who did her PhD with me, is actually doing a survey now in Thailand of what happened during the COVID period. And it's quite interesting to see that since the COVID has finished, well, it hasn't finished, but since it's kind of finished, um, people now are more confident about using technology and about using online learning. And over 50% of people feel that they can use technology to teach. The problem is that they can't teach. They don't know how to do it using whatever modern technology is available. They don't know how to do it, partly because their models are problematic. So their teaching models are problematic. Their big picture models are problematic, and they basically improvise, but feel that they are doing okay.
On what basis?
Self basis. We're doing okay. We're doing as well as we were in face to face, or something like that, or nearly as much as well. Because
So
no
one
one
cannot
says
criticize. One cannot
we're doing better.
criticize it. Yeah, one cannot criticize this when 99% of the literature is stuck in those concepts that I have written here.
Yes.
And then when you have the criticism, so for example, the Indonesian government, right, Lala, when I was reading your PhD, so the Indonesian government says, all right, you're doing all this inductive learning. We have had it. Kids are not learning. Let's go and do the focus on form. So it's like literally you're always from one extreme to the next, right? And I cannot understand. I mean, honestly, Lala, Andrew, I know Andrew. Maybe he is intelligent, but Jesus, is it that hard? I mean, like maybe it is. Maybe geniuses are really.
No,
Sorry,
no,
Andrew, I don't
no.
want to blow your trumpet, but basically,
No.
I just think that maybe innovation is really that hard. It's so hard. It's not hard.
Well,
Maybe I don't know, because how come you have you
it,
made the meaning and form interact together in a way that neither you were doing contrived tasks, neither were you doing some hypothetical feedback models that had no basis to actually work. Like, say, I don't want, like RIP Michael
well,
Long, but as much as I have
let
respect for the
me,
scholar,
yeah,
there was no basis there.
let me add one thing that I didn't add before. I was in a French department. In the French department, we didn't read at the time a lot of stuff from Tessot. So I was kind of immune from Widdowson and Co. Not that I didn't know they existed. Of course, I knew they existed, but I didn't read them avidly, and I typically I don't accept what I read, so I don't just swallow it and say, "Oh, it wouldn't," a famous person said it, so it must be true. So in this French department, I was surrounded by some very brilliant people, and semioticians. At least two were semioticians, but it wasn't just the fact that they were semioticians. The fact is that they were excellent thinkers, and that allowed me the kinds of work that we were doing in terms of that they were doing in terms of semiotics, but in which they included me very kindly, allowed me to start thinking um, in terms of how can I help students
In the light of
without,
all of that. Yeah.
in the light of all of that, in the light of all of that, how can I make my teaching and their learning more effective and give them feedback in a way which will enable them to be self-sufficient. And that was the key. So that it took some pressure away from the teachers, but it also took and it shifted the responsibility to some extent on the student, but through the mediating effect of the technology. And actually, the first ever computer program I ever wrote was on a huge KL10 machine, which was a machine that filled a room, on an interactive keyboard, on a typewriter keyboard, I mean a terminal. And it was a closed test. And the first thing that I tried to do that was kind of meaningful was, let's say they get the word wrong. What do you know what a closed test is? It's you fill in the blank in a sentence or whatever.
Anya went school.
Yes, or once upon there were three. Once upon a time there were three bears. And the point was, what do you say to people when they get it wrong? The point was not when they get it right. When they get it right, it's easy because they got it right. So there's nothing wrong with the way their brain is working. You know what I mean. How do you give them feedback that will be useful to them and which will allow them to organize what they have in their heads in light of what they see in front of them? So that was the first thing with that stupid closed test. And then I started to think, okay, well, if we can prove, then I did many other things, including, silly things like programs that could give you 42,000 different sentences for the subjunctive in French. It's very easy to do, actually. Teachers loved the subjunctive program. They used to love making sure that they got the tenses, the moves right and the tenses right. So students liked it less. But the ones that students did really like was when I switched to a problem like listening comprehension. So listening comprehension, how do you support listening comprehension, which is a complex skill?
So
And
where
so
the grammar and other
it runs
aspects,
with this other stuff.
where the grammar and other aspects of language form, let's say, were
Right.
integrated with other skills, so they could see
Yes.
the reason that
Yes.
there was more connections were made. Andrew, I don't want to go on too long today because you ask us not to keep it too long. So can you finish this, okay, what you wanted to say, and then could you summarize it in terms of the topic of today? What is the learner perspective in your research? How you define it? So, so could you please summarize whatever and what you were saying, Andrew?
So yeah, so the learner perspective. So just to finish off the listening comprehension. The listening comprehension is actually a very good example of what I'm interested in. The learner perspective is how do I give students the ability, and this is from from a technological point of view, and this is from a teacher's point of view. This is not a philosophical point of view. The philosophical point of view would include issues like what kind of intellectual framework do we use for our teaching. I would say we can use what's generally called a rhizomatic model. The rhizomatic model is a model where it's a form of self-directed learning where students are free to determine their own way through some kind of task that is offered. It's a little bit like Sugata Mitra's self-organizing learning environments. In fact, it's very similar. And it's interesting that Sugata Mitra doesn't talk at all about rhizomatic systems, but is entirely self-referential,
Yes,
which is fine.
yeah, which is
Which
fine.
is fine.
Yes.
So, and I have no problems with that.
I think there's something to be said about being self-referential. I think people, on the one hand, certainly my work, my publications and my work is a bit different because I cannot afford being self-referential. But I think you get to a point where fighting with other people takes too much space on the page when you publish, and you really cannot explain what really matters and the innovation in your own work. So it gets to the point where you have to just go somewhere
But
else.
the trouble is that current research wants you to connect to other things. It doesn't want you just want to hear your story. It wants you to
Yeah,
say,
but
"Oh, it's a
but the
bit
people
like
you
this.
would
Oh, it's
connect
a bit
with,
like that."
yeah, yeah. So it's okay. So yes, so learn the
So,
perspective.
so from the learner perspective, it's very simple. It simply says this: if the student has a task to perform, and I'm not talking about task-based learning. I'm talking about things that they have to do in order to achieve their objectives. And the things that they have to do may be as complex as creating a day on French television, and we've talked about this before in the past, uh, or as simple, or as so as complicated as that, which is a complex task, or as simple as I can't say the French sound U, so how am I going to get better? And these are difficulties that they encounter by interacting with the range of tasks that are in front of them that they need to perform in order to succeed.
In what way is your concept of learner perspective different from the pedagogy of Widowson, or the way how people typically think?
I was going to add that one of the things I'm really interested in is the kind of moment-to-moment problems that students encounter
Feel, yeah.
or feel. Actually, you're right. The students feel, and how do they go about solving them? And here's where the problem lies. The problem with all of these things is that in order to deal with people's feelings and meet, let's say, that's how I define a need. A need is something which happens when there's an interaction between the student and a task that they're trying to do and they can't do it. And they know they can't do it. And they know that there's a problem, or somebody tells them that there's a problem. So they need to fix it. How do they fix it? How do they go about fixing it? Well, they can get some help from other people, or they can get a computer program, or they can read a book, or whatever it is that they want to do. So they can try to fix it that way. The only problem is that it takes time. It takes a lot of time. And we need two things in language learning. We need language samples of some kind, and we need time. They're the two major things that we need. The rest we can find solutions for. But time is never available in the educational systems that we currently have. So time becomes, it's 15 weeks or it's 3 hours in this lesson in this week, and you have to do it in these 3 hours, and you will never do it again, or you will do it only, briefly in the future. So you need time, you need the ability to reorganize yourself. You need what we might call extensive reading or extensive listening, or you need all of these things are about time. So the extension of things is critical, and we don't have it. But providing extensive what currently we do in terms of extensive reading and listening and so on is really not sufficient. We need smarter ways of giving feedback, which is individualized, and things like artificial intelligence may help us someday, but maybe not. Maybe there are some things which we already have under control. It's unlikely that an artificial intelligence system could guess accurately the craziness of my students' responses to the task of writing a chunk down
I
in
think we
my
need
in
to
my in my 1983 program.
I think we need to follow it up this discussion a little bit next time, because that needs a little bit more ironing out, Andrew. So that was good. But obviously, one can write a PhD, as Lala can testify to it, just on this very concept. Actually, that's what I did. I wrote theoretical PhD just on this concept. Lala, if I can come back now to you. So you've listened to everything what Andrew said. And I think now, when it comes to the learner perspective, I like using it because there is such a thing in social sciences, what they call standpoint perspective.
Hmm.
So you write from the perspective of the woman, you write from the perspective of, I don't know, Christian, you write from the perspective of whatever, as if the being a woman is somehow self-defining,
Hmm.
as if, and unproblematic as a result, obvious, as if being a learner is, can be captured. Well, we can't capture it in terms of some deterministic needs. We developed this concept together, which is called, to describe what Andrew is doing and the framework we're working in, it's called, what do we call it? Multisensory load reduction strategies, right?
Strategies. Yep.
So that's a marriage of those 50 years of research that Andrew began and were further taken up sort of by me and now by you.
Hmm.
How are you faring in Indonesia with now today with your colleagues and maybe colleagues from other universities as you write, um, and as you publish and as you talk with that concept? Are people looking at you like at an alien, just fell out of Mars, and
Right.
as soon as he stops talking we will be comfortable because we're gonna go back to normal? So I mean, I know I've seen it all,
Yeah.
so multi-sensory, what do I say, load reduction
Adoption
strategies. So
strategies.
how are
Yeah.
people responding to you? How are you faring with it, and what are your plans?
All right. So I'm very happy. I'm very glad that I could learn that new thing from Andrew and you, because that's, I think that's the legacy that I can have from you both. So I've been here for probably a year now, probably more than a year, and I talked to many people about the new concept of learning, and then I think it takes a lot of courage and patience to introduce the new concept of learning, the concept of agency, the concept of the model that we have developed in Australia. And I think, but that's fine. The very essential point that I keep talking to my colleagues, to my students, is that my research that I developed with Professor Andrew Lyon and Anya Lyon has that intellectual robustness. Think in the context of 21st century learning, intellectual robustness is the key to doing things. And the four indicators of intellectual robustness are: number one, I need to get involved in research that makes me think, right? Because back in 2016, you sent me a paper on aesthetics, and I was quite amazed. How can I use neurological principles of aesthetics into academic writing? So it makes me think. And then number two, I think I said to myself, I need to get engaged with research that challenges unexamined assumptions. So that's very important for me to develop my own courage to challenge the unexamined questions about speech perception, about the learning perception of students. How can we actually help students read and write better without using the available model, right? And then the third principle is I need to get engaged with research that asks hard questions. Back in 2017, I could not answer the questions posed by Professor Andrew Lyon in a rehearsal. I could not answer the question, what is learning, what is a learner, and blah, blah, blah. And it it's simply a driver for me to learn more. And then I think the fourth principle is the one that I need to get engaged with the research that does not offer superficial answer. So I think I have been keeping those spirit with me, Anya and Andrew, and I think people are now getting more engaged with the new concept of learning and agency and the multisensorial reduction strategies. They now probably are now more interested in exploring the ideas about intonations, emotions, movement, and learning. So I think yes, it's simply taking more courage and patience, but I really enjoy the process of learning after doing my PhD. Right. So
I think.
that's my comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think. Just wanted to say something. I think that to summarize, to summarize, I wanted to say I think that to summarize the concept, I'm just not going to go into the deep now, but so the learner perspective from the perspective of ontology, which is how we see each other and ourselves in the world. I think Andrew would say, and there's evidence for it, but we're talking pedagogy, so we're using the evidence from different disciplines now to actually integrate it into our own action as language teachers. Yes, you can predict some things that your students will get wrong, but what you cannot predict, probably, is the entire set of networks that cause that errors, and as a result, how to correct it. So just because your students will not be able to say the sound "oo," now I think that what Andrew was explaining is you have to find what you said, robust methodology that enables you to develop exercises that you predict, exercises or yes, that enable students to correct it without being too deterministic, which means this causes that. Because if you say, well, they can't pronounce U because they are English or Indonesian, true. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? Until you go to the very bottom of, the micro world where you can't see anything, right? So you have to have, it's like I'm talking, physics now. You can see the chair, you can see the tree, but when you go closer, closer, closer to the quantum level, everything is the same. Right? So you can't really see. So that's the problem between the cause and reaction or explanation of events. So yes, we can have linguistics, we can have neuroscience, but these are models of reality, not reality itself. And I think that what I wanted to achieve through the talk today is to talk a little bit about the origins of the discourse of learner-centeredness, which is the Chomsky's idea, and that was his contribution, probably. Then the kind of struggles that the world of pedagogy, of language teaching, found itself in, well, if it is learner, then it must be all about how the learner finds him or herself in the meanings of a foreign language. And therefore, we just don't want to. And then the strange sort of implications followed, like inductive learning and all of that. And when people, I think, in the past were reading too closely and were following the inductive learning and all of that without actually trying to break it down further to have a look, what does the inductive learning mean and all of that, we found ourselves without tools. Technology developed, I might be wrong, but from what I have seen, technology developed, and then we worked with those tools from the past, which is the audiolingual and the grammar and the clause exercises and all of that, but never really generated technology-based tools that would allow students to fix their own problems. That we So the tools that we created on the basis of our predictions, but that gave students enough robustness to actually find themselves in it, so respond to their own questions within the task that they can't complete, right? Respond to their own questions, which they experience, feel Andrew was talking about. Anyway, to summarize, Andrew and Lala, I've got another quote, but I'll just leave people here because we need to, when you write your PhD, maybe not so much the articles, which is a little bit of a pity, but when you write your articles, your supervisory panel will ask you, what's your role in this research? Are you the god that manages all the puzzle pieces? You know what the learner is, you know what the learner needs, you know what to do to fix the learner and all of that. What's your role in it? Are you the god or are you the helping hand? Are you define yourself? And this is where a lot of students, especially students who don't have enough preparation in intellectual, philosophical, or even science, methodology of science narratives, that's where all breaks down. So they go to I don't know what people do. Maybe they bypass it, this question. Maybe they read methodology textbooks and just summarize some chapter, introduction to science methods or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's an important question to answer. Australian PhD students have to answer this question, and I think it's. I got it from Bourdieu here. I was a keen student of Bourdieu. Helped me a lot. Pierre Bourdieu, a sociologist from France. So he says that science reifies reality, and in this way creates its own objective world. I think it's extremely important. What science says they understand, it's within the what do you call it, the bubble that they create. It doesn't mean that the trains don't run and that we don't have a GPS. We do, because there's a reality interaction between the bubble and the reality, right? And if it works, it's good enough. That's pragmatism. But it doesn't actually mean. So I think that what happens now with us is not to think that the bubble we create about the learner, but it doesn't replace the learner, right? I think, and that's the point about the learner perspective. However we frame what the learner is within our assumption, from the perspective of evidence or our assumptions about what matters, we're creating our own bubble. And what we need to do is to now, with that bubble, the bubble needs to now cannot replace the learner, right? So the learner is not there. It's not right. So and how we support our students now. So the function of the bubble is to support the student, not to replace him. And how we're going to solve that interaction between the bubble we create and the student, I think we might talk about it throughout other podcasts that we will be running, because I don't want to really summarize it within 30 seconds and basically lose it, because it's the core of good pedagogy. So not to hijack the learner, not to say that that's the question the learner has on the mind, because my theory says so, and I am the one who is delivering the +1 in to the I, right? Um, so this is hijacking the learner, and replacing the learner with the bubble of your assumptions. So you need to still keep the learner, and your assumptions are to support, not to replace. And I think, what do you think, Andrew? That would be an interesting way to follow up this topic. Maybe through your own research, by reading some literature, examples of studies.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So that's the ontology. And just to finish it, and I'm not going to go through it, but this is another quote that I used in my PhD, and I advise my students to actually contemplate or spend time thinking about it. It's about linguistics, basically. So if you think of an artist as a speaker of a language, and now of the art critic as linguistics. So basically, you can talk about the painting, but you will never, through that talk, enable another person to paint that painting the same way. No talk, no explanations about how the painting was painted can make another person create the same painting, right? If it Right. So, and that's the trouble, what we have to solve in our language teaching. No amount of linguistics and no amount of explanations of how text works produced by linguistics is going to make the student understand how to create texts. So I'm not saying linguistics doesn't have its place, but what I'm saying is it cannot replace the brain of the student or how the connections work, because then we hijack the learner. Not only that, we monopolize the inquiry about communication and how communication works with one model of reality. That's not fair. Stifles research. Okay, so one sentence from both of you, and I think that this is a good point for me to finish. Andrew, how would you relate what I'm talking about now about the ontology of the learner perspective, and in relation, just in one sentence, to your work and Lala the same?
Well, it's the issue that the high. I'm thinking particularly of the hijacking issue. Hijacking happens in in a way, in traditional education. We just assume that we are the bosses and that we have the skills to deal with things. But the reality is we don't and we can't. So there's not going to be any, the hijacking is going to happen, but it's not going to solve anything. So we need to move beyond that. That's my
And
goodbye
your concern
statement for
is
today.
right. And your concern in your research is how to create robust enough environments that actually enable students to personalize their learning.
Right, and not just to, well, to personalize them, personalize it, and yeah, and solve it. I suppose solve the problem. Personalizing is one thing, but finding solutions may be a little different. I can personalize my learning and get nowhere.
Right.
And part of the difficulty that we are faced with is that we we don't believe that learners are able to fix their own learning.
Yeah.
And there may
Because
be some instances where that is true, but at the same time, there is also evidence that they can. But the
Like
price,
Sugata Mitra, yes.
like Sugata Mitra, like my own students' work in tourism, English for tourism, and so on, they can. But I think that the price is time.
Mm.
As people navigate through their difficulties and discover, oh, this won't work, this doesn't work, and let me try something else.
But they need help, right? So our
But they need
job,
help. They need help.
our
And our
job is to
job is to
provide.
provide that. And there are many ways in which we can provide help. One of which is to develop infrastructures that they can access if and when they need them.
Mm.
So I think that I wanted Andrew to talk today. To summarize, I wanted Andrew to talk about his past, because what I wanted to for people to see is that today our computers have a much greater power and capacities than they did in the past. And I think if language departments connect with what Andrew used to do also, connect with the technology departments at university, and the students, technology students, can actually design these exercises, these things that you will ask them for. They could do it as an assignment. So you can have this collaboration between two different disciplines. Students writing the computer based programs for you as assignments, and you can actually do a lot of things for your students. Even simple things might be actually, as Andrew was talking about them, quite useful and making a difference. Lala, so the learner.
Before we move on, I just wanted to add something, which is it would be almost trivial to reproduce the setup that we had at the University of Queensland
Mm.
for developing listening comprehension. Almost trivial, and I say almost because somebody has to do some programming work, but
Yeah.
not a great deal of it. And and then it would be there, which is amazing because it's taken 40 years for me to achieve nothing in that area because I
Lala,
didn't
you,
have the time or whatever. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that because
yeah,
Mm.
it's
and I
people
hope
think, oh,
you,
it's going to be very difficult, it's going to be very complicated, it's going to be very tough, it's going to be impossible, we can never do it. Not true.
well, you write
Yeah.
systems for all my PhD students, which I'm very grateful for.
Mm.
Lala, maybe I will focus you a bit better. So we have you because you were talking on that issue of learner perspective, and also Indonesia. I taught in Cambodia online,
Yeah.
so I was contributing to your class, but I wasn't taking the
Yeah.
full load. But in other subjects, I was actually doing the guest teaching and so on. So I felt the whole load and was responsible for my students. So I
Yeah.
understand the pains you were mentioning about the online environment and so on. Um, I forgot now the question I wanted to say. You were teaching when you were using Andrew systems. You did something I didn't do with the Cambodian students, and that was interesting. I felt the pain, or we felt with Andrew the results of it. I didn't have the time for it. Andrew's talking about the time. We didn't have the time. So, what you did, you took the self paced exercises your
Right.
students were asked to complete on a weekly basis. Some of that load you were doing in class.
Yeah.
Now I know why you were doing this, and now, especially now, after I've done Vietnam and after I've done Cambodia, I know exactly why you were doing this. But I want you to tell us about the learner perspective ontology and your realities. So you wanted them to find themselves, to find solutions to their own problems in an exploratory way, and you provided all of that, but you still drag them into the class and you ask
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Right. So I think now it's more challenging to teach English in my university because we have restrictive policies on attendance, grades, assignments, and so on and so forth. Well, I hope that I can reuse the same verbotenal approach, reading for emotion and aesthetics at the same time because um, I think I can I can work with my students in the most exploratory way. When I use verbatim approach in my class, we only spent like 15 to 25 minutes for doing the listening exercises. So I think we only had one single sentence in listening exercise, doing the movement and blah blah blah. So it's like a morning exercise, and then we could use the rest of the learning hour for dealing with emotions and aesthetics. But the only problem I had back then in 2018 was that since my students were framed in a teacher-centric system, it was quite challenging for them at first to have courage to be on their own. I think that's the pictures we had learned in the previous self-access center. And I see a big difference between how my daughter survived in the COVID-19 school. I think when we had online classes in Darwin, which is very short, like 3 weeks, my daughter learned by herself. Every time I and my wife tried to help her, she always refused. Daddy, I can do it by myself. Please stop bothering me. That's what she said to me. Oh, I think it gives me an impression that the Australian education system was actually good and that it helps my kid to grow into a more responsible learner. But back then in 2018, it was pretty much challenging for my students to learn on their own. Okay, so in this case, it's still very important for me to engage in a hybrid classroom. Probably we can have the online system, but we have to use the offline system as well. But
So
that's challenging.
one of the principles of learner-centeredness, which I think is, yeah. So anyway, I think it's a good idea. I mean, when they talk about learner responsibility, um, I think it is to actually have some sort of intrinsic will to do things
Yeah.
themselves, not all right. So we will, but one way you solved it was actually to show students the power of those call-based systems by
Right.
actually exposing them to that in classroom. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, you were my student, so I focused very much on the results of your study and on the quality of your writing. So that was great. But I didn't learn that lesson because
Mm,
I was so stuck in the paradigm that students do it on their own. And obviously, I
yeah.
was stuck in the Australian paradigm where
Right.
it is not a problem for us. I mean,
Mm,
in Australia, you might have 2 contact hours, but you're expected for the subject to work eight
mm,
additional hours
right.
at home every week. So it's like, it's inside of you. It's you understand that. So when I was teaching in Cambodia, I made available to our students extracurricular activities online.
Mm,
They weren't doing them. And I didn't take them I mean, I showed them, but they
mm,
didn't feel the power of those, and
ah,
nobody was doing those.
right.
Andrew offered them the entire system of his to improve their pronunciation.
Mm,
But you always can, I can, everybody can, right? And they weren't doing this. I mean, a few students, I can't remember the results exactly, but maybe one or two maybe did the whole thing. But we had
right.
40 or 46 people, and I think
Mm,
that was the biggest flop ever Andrew had. I mean, Andrew had some other flops with people not participating, but this was, I think, the biggest we've ever had. Literally, students
mm,
just turned away. Um, could be many reasons for it. Whatever the reasons are, I think one of the things that I learned from you was to organize the schedule in such a way that to actually integrate, at least in the beginning, some of those
yeah.
so that students either go through them or learn the power of those exercises and maybe then get motivated. But that was a big lesson for me.
Mm,
All right, we might, Andrew and Lala, do you agree? We might finish for today, not to drag it too long.
yeah.
And
Sure.
and we might continue our discussion with more and more examples as we follow through these podcasts. So thank you so much for coming here. Thank you everyone
Thank you.
who
Thank you, everyone.
came along and listened, and those people who also will watch us in the future. So thank you so much, and see you in 2 weeks.
All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.